Okay. So what promotion is when, like Aryan said, it's when your pawn gets to the edge of the board and then you can change it into a different piece. So in this case, let's say we are white, right? So we're going up and then black is moving down. So our pawns, we know that they start on the second rank or second row, right? And so what a promotion is when your pawn gets from the second row to the eighth row, then you can change it into a different piece. Or so like let's say this pawn, I just put these two pawns here, right? Now let's say this pawn, it moved to the eighth row. Now I can change it into one of these pieces. I can't change it into another king because you can't have two kings, right? But I can change it into any one of these pieces. So if I wanted, I could get a queen, bishop, rook, or knight. And most of the time you want to get a queen because a queen is the most powerful, right? A queen is like a fusion of the rook and the bishop, like we already stated before. Sometimes in special circumstances, you'll get the knight. That's very rare. Ian? Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So like you're saying that if I already have a queen, right? Yeah, so even if you already have a queen, you can still get another. You can get yeah, you can just do it like that. So if yeah. So like let's say let me just add a position. Okay. And now let's say we already had a rook, a queen, a bishop and a knight. Let's say we already had all of these pieces, right? We can still promote and get another queen. Like that. Is that what you were asking? Well, most chessboards they'll like have an extra queen, so yeah, you could just use that. And if you're playing on chess.com, it'll just automatically give you another queen if you want. Yeah, so it makes it much easier, right? So if you have two queens, you have double the power and it's much stronger. Yeah, you can just keep getting more queens. Like let's say this. Yeah, yeah, it's just like a way to get a lot more powerful pieces. Yeah. Do you have a question? Sanjeevi? Are you kind of muted yourself? Sorry, I didn't get your question. Uh, I don't know. Like, I guess so. Like, are you talking about in, like a real game if you run out of queens, right? Most of the time, you don't have to worry about that. Like, they'll have two queens, and you probably won't need like a third queen to win the game. Because if you have, yeah, yeah, yeah. So, well, then you could just like, I guess, use a different like coin or something, just to signify a coin. Okay. So now this is promotion. Now let's move on to the next thing. So now we looked at promotion, and then there was castling, right? Oh, I did not mean to clear it. Okay, there we go. And we saw that there is two types of castling. So castling is basically when you move your king two squares to either side, so two squares to the right or two squares to the left, and then the rook jumps over. So like, let's say we're white, right? And we move our king two squares to the right, and then the rook jumps over. Now this is castling. And the reason that we do castling is so that the king is much safer. So you saw in this position, like usually we move this pawn forward in the first move of the game, right? Or this pawn, or something like that. So when we do that, the king will get weak. See? Now it's like, maybe it can get attacked. But if we castle, then the king is safe, right? These three pawns are just like a wall in front of the king. The rook is also helping defend. So that's why castling is important. And when you castle to the right, if you're white, then this is called kingside castling. And if you castle to the left, it's called queenside castling. And you might wonder why this is. But you'll notice that the queen, like white queen is usually right here, right? The white queen is usually right there in like an actual board. So you'll notice that the queen side is basically all the like left for white. So all of like these squares right here. King side is where the kings are. It's the side of the king. So that's the king side. And then that's why it's called kingside castling if you go to the right, because it's the king moving closer to the right. And then the queenside castling is when you move to the left. And queenside castling is basically the same thing. You move your king 2 squares to the left, and then the rook jumps over. Alright, does anyone have any questions? Nicholas? You're on mute. Oh, you're on mute, Nicholas. I don't understand. Like, first try? Like. Oh, you're talking about like the starting position? Okay, so like if we're looking at here, the only reason way you can castle is if all the other pieces in the like these squares are gone. So basically the king needs a clear path. Like you see, the king is not like the knight, right? So we already learned that the knight, it can jump over pieces like this. It just jumped over this pawn, right? But the king can't jump. So if the king wants to move 2 squares to the right, then this knight has to be gone. So let's say we move it there. Then it still can't move 2 squares, right? Because the bishop is blocking. So now we need to try and move the bishop away. So now we did that. Okay, now the rook and the king are looking at each other, right? They're looking directly, then only you can castle. And same with the other side. So if we wanted to castle queen side, then the queen needs to move, the bishop needs to move, and the knight needs to move, and then you can castle queen side. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, now let's move on to, so we talked about promotion and castling. Our next is looking at en passant. And we'll only look at this for a bit because it'll rarely happen in your games, but let's just look at it for a bit, I guess. So what en passant is like, let's say we're starting, this is the starting position, right? Here. Now let's say we moved our pawn 2 squares forward. And black moved his, I don't know, pawn here. Then you moved your pawn 1 square forward again. Now you notice that it's on the 5th row, right? Or 5th rank. So if it's on the 5th rank, then if black moves one of his pawns that are right next to our pawns, so like right next to means like one of these files, right? So right next to our white pawn, 2 squares forward, so that they're right next to each other like this, or like let's say if you went here. Then if you do something like that, we can move our pawn diagonally. And then this pawn is like disappears. So basically it's a special way to capture. And basically you can only do this when our pawn is on the fifth row, or like for black, they would be on the fourth row, right? Like if it's like this, then black needs to get his pawn somewhere here to do en passant. And it only works when the opponent, they move their pawn 2 squares forward on the starting move. So remember how I said, like Ian said at the beginning, that one of the special rules is that the pawn on the first move, it can move 2 squares, right? So let's say that they do that, okay? And then our pawn is right next to it. Then we can move diagonally one and then capture. So that is en passant. But you guys don't really need to worry too much about that. It's just like an extra rule. If that will rarely come up in the games. Okay. So these are the 3 special rules of chess. And now let's get started into like the actual game. So does anyone have any questions on these 3 special rules or any of how the pieces move? Any questions about that? And if you do, I'll explain it, but you can also watch the recordings of the previous classes because I think I've been sending those to you. I remember a few people weren't able to get it, so I just like sent it a few minutes ago. But if you have any questions on that, you could just rewatch those videos to understand. So any questions right now? No? Okay then. So how about yeah, Sanjeevi? Well, technically yes. Kind of. So you'll notice that our we if we're white, right? Then we start on 1. But if we're black, we start on 8. So black's fifth row would just be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it would be our fourth row. So it's like switched around. Yeah. Well, not really. It's just each side has their half. So half of 8 is 4, so each side gets 4 rows. But sometimes that like depending on where your pieces are, you might seem like you have 5 rows or 6 rows. Yeah. Okay. So now let's go to let's learn about, does everyone know what checkmate is? Okay. So let's just look over it to make sure. So checkmate is the way to win in chess, right? So that is the goal of chess. So what you want to do, checkmate, is basically, actually first let's look at check because that might, let me just create a new board. Okay. So check is when you use one of your pieces and then you attack the opponent's king. So what does that look like? So you'll notice that in this position, if our queen over here, we said it can move up and down, side to side, or diagonal, remember? So if it moves all the way over here, which is diagonal, right? Then it is attacking the black king. And when it does that, this is called check. Now, if check happens, then like black has to try and defend this king, right? So he has a few options. He can, one, capture the piece that's giving the check. So can black somehow capture this queen? Aryan? Yeah. So if all the pieces are gone and it's only the two kings, then you can't checkmate. And that's a draw. And a draw is, we'll look at that in like a bit. But a draw is basically when neither person can win. So it's like, yeah, it's just a draw. Nicholas? Well, anyways, in a chess position, there always has to be two kings. But we'll just look at that in a bit. So, but does anybody have the answer to this question? Can this white queen be captured? Yeah, it can't, right? It cannot be captured. So, there is three ways to try and stop a check. So right now, black's king is in check, right? Our queen is attacking. So first is capture. Then the second is block. So can this queen, like, can this be blocked, this check? Ian? Yeah, exactly. So this pawn right here, it can move one square, right? And now it's blocking this check. Now this king is no longer in danger, and this pawn is attacking the queen. Because remember, the pawns attack diagonally one square in front. Nice, good job. So this is another way. So capture, and we can't capture the queen. Block. The third and final option is to move. Now can this king move? No, right? The queen is blocking here. These two pawns are blocking. This bishop is blocking. If it goes here, it's still in check. So the only way to protect this king is to block. So the like acronym or like short way to say that is CBM. So if you're ever in check, just think of CBM. So C stands for capture. So can you capture the piece that's attacking the king? B stands for block. Can you block? And M stands for move. Can you move your king? So you should always think of that if you're ever in check. Okay, now I'll show you what checkmate is. Actually, I think we can choose this position. So, like, let's say that in this position, right? So now now we have to think about our three-word phrase, right? So CBM. So can this queen be captured? No. Can it be blocked? No. Can the king move? No. So when all three of these are not possible, this is checkmate. It's when your king cannot move and you cannot stop the check. So this is checkmate. And once you get this kind of position, this is game over. You win. So we'll look at a few ways to do checkmate and how to do with very few pieces. But does everyone understand the basic concept of checkmate? The CBM rule. Okay, so everyone understands, right? Okay. So now we know what check and checkmate are. So check is, just think of, if you're ever in check, right? It's when you attack the opponent's king or the opponent's king attacks your king. Then you have to think of CBM, capture, block, or move. If you can't do any of those three, then it's checkmate, and that's win or lose, right? So the person giving the checkmate, so if we're white and we're giving the checkmate, we win. Okay, now let's go on to one more thing, and we can look at this for a bit. So this is called notation. And what notation is the easiest way to like tell where a piece is. wheat piece or pawn. So you'll notice that on the side of the board there's these numbers, right? And there's these letters. The letters go from A through H, and the numbers go from 1 to 8. So I said that there's 8 rows, right? So if you're on this one, then that's the first row, second row, third row, fourth row, fifth row, sixth row, seventh row, eighth row. Then there is the files. So the files are like the A file, so A, B, C file, D file, E file, F file, G file, H file. So it's the first rank. So this is the side to side or rows. These are called ranks. The up and down are called files. So let's say I'm clicking on this square, right? Now how do we say this square? So what we do is we say the letter first and then the number. So what letter file is this on? So if we go down, we'll see that this is the D files. So we say D, then we'll look at from the side the number. So this is 5. So this square is D5. How about this square? Does anyone know? Orion? Yeah, this is G7. How about this square? Nicholas? Oh, you're on mute. Is this H8? You're saying H, so H is over here. This would be H. This is, yeah, so this is A8, right? I think that's what you said. I might not have heard you. Okay, so this square is A8. It's on the A file, then the 8th rank. How about here? Uh, Anu? So you're on mute. Yeah, this square is G4, right? It's on the G file and the 4th rank. Let's just do one more. This square. Yeah, this square is C5. Alright, so this is how we say notation. But now let's move on to a bit more complicated notation. So notice on the side, right? Whenever I like play a move, it gives like a sequence, right? So sometimes if I move a pawn, it's just giving the square, right? It just, you see here in yellow, it's just giving the square, right? So pawns, when you move a pawn, you only give the square that the pawn moved to. So this pawn, it was on E2, right? E file, second rank. Now that we moved it, it's still on the E file, but now it's on the 4th rank. So now we say this pawn is on E4. So all we have to write is E4. We don't have to write E2, E4. Just write E4, and that's fine. So and then next, black moved the F pawn, right? So this pawn over here is on, what square is this pawn on right now? Ian? Yeah, this pawn is on F7 right now, right? If you move it 2 squares up, now it is on F5, right? So 5th rank F file. So now let's move on to a different piece. So how do we say the knight moving, right? For the knight, what we do is this knight from G1, right? This knight is on G1. We just say F3, right? But you'll notice that there's a capital N. So for the knight, to say that a knight moved somewhere, we use a capital N. For the bishop, we use a capital B. So you'll notice that I had a knight move, right? And then black played a knight move. And then we use the bishop. So we just say capital N for knight or capital B for bishop, and then wherever the bishop or knight or any other piece moved to. So this bishop, even though it was on F1, we don't need to say bishop F1 to B5, right? We can just say bishop to B5 because that's the last place that this bishop was on. Alright? So now let's see the other pieces. So for the rook, we say capital R. The rook is capital R. Alright? And then we have the queen, which is capital Q. Finally, the king, which is capital K. So these are the pieces, right? So pieces and the pawns. So pawns, all you have to say is the place that they move to. You don't need to put like capital P for pawn. It's just pawn. The pawn just moves, right? So it's just E4. For like a knight, you say capital N and then where it moved to. For the bishop, capital B and then where it moved. The queen, capital Q. The rook, capital R. And the king, capital K. Does anybody have any questions on that? Nicholas? Yeah, so like the king starts with K, right? So it'll say K. The queen starts with Q, so it's capital Q. The only exception is the knight. Because like knight is spelled with a silent K, right? It's Knight. And the king also starts with a K. But you just say N for knight instead. That's the only exception. But everything else is just normal. And then the pawns you don't do anything. It's just a pawn, so you don't you just leave it at the square. Aryan? The square, yeah. Yeah, that is what notation is. Alright, now there is how do we say that something is being captured? Now, what does that mean? So, we know that, like, in this position, right? Now, this knight, we know that it moves in an L shape, right? Like this. So, if it moves in an L shape, then it can take this pawn, right? So, how do we write that? So, to say a capture, then we put the piece in front, the piece like symbol, right? So we know that the symbol for the knight is N, capital N, right? Then we say X. So the X means that it is capturing something. So when you see an X, it means that the knight has captured something, alright? And then you say the square that it captured. So it's captured E5. E5. Alright? So any questions on that? Alright, yeah, that was pretty simple, right? Now let's move on to castling. How would we write castling? So for castling, well, actually it depends on which side you're castling to. Let me just like play a bunch of random moves. Okay, so now we've learned that there's two types of castling, right? There's castling king side and castling queen side. Okay, so if we castle king side, that means to the right, right? Right two squares. Then once we do that, yeah, never mind. One second. We use a O and then a dash and then another O. Alright? So this is how you say castling kingside.